Welcome to the Never Were's, a whole series of videos about films and concepts that were never made or never fully realized. The critical and financial success of 1933's King Kong inspired a lot of studios and producers to try to recapture the success of the 1933 original. One of the first examples of this is 1934's The Lost Island, which was a one-reel short Technicolor musical spoof of King Kong. It was intended to be a feature-length film, but the studio ran out of money and they weren't able to actually finish the movie. Now, The Lost Island was the brainchild of choreographer and director Leroy Pins, who ended up directing the movie. He also choreographed the musical numbers in the movie, because the film was also not only a spoof or a parody of King Kong, but it was also a musical. And this film actually featured some pretty impressive practical effects for the time. Instead of stop motion, the scenes with King Kong were done using an actor in a suit. The actor's name was Charles Gamora, and this is an actor who actually was really impressive, and so impressive the people that actually did see the film were so impressed that they thought that Charles Gamora was the one that played King Kong in the 1933 film. And there were rumors that were spread that Charles Gamora was the one who played Kong and brought Kong to life, and it wasn't Willis O'Brien and his stop-motion effects. Of course, these were rumors that Charles Gamora himself vehemently denied for years. Interestingly enough, Rick Baker, who would go on to play King Kong in the ape suit in the 1976 remake, he was a big fan of Charles Gamora. And this is a film that also had dinosaurs and things like that as well, and they were portrayed by people in costumes. And the movie was supposed to be, like I said, a feature-length film, but the money ran out, it went way over budget, and production was stopped. What's ironic about this film is that it is completely and totally lost. The only things that exist when it comes to The Lost Island, the only last vestiges of its existence are a few photographs, because the actual one-reel Technicolor short itself has completely vanished. After the release of Son of Kong, Marion C. Cooper was really interested and intrigued on doing another Kong sequel. This time he had an idea of doing a prequel of sorts to the 1933 film and have it take place during the time period when Kong is being shipped on the boat on the Venture to New York City. His idea was to have a film that could be loosely titled possibly The New Adventures of King Kong, and that would be the main focus of the plot. It would be about the crew of the Venture, including Carl Denham, and their journey to New York City from Skull Island. And they would encounter some dinosaurs or some sort of threats along the way, and in order to combat them, in order to survive, they would let Kong loose from his chains, and Kong would fight them and save them, and then they would trap him again and chain him up again and then ship him to New York City. Well, when Marion C. Cooper talked to Ernest B. Schoedsack about this, he was like, no. We've milked this franchise dry. I don't think we should do this. And that was that. That was it. In 1952, after a recent re-release of the 1933 film King Kong, Marion C. Cooper became very interested and curious about remaking the film himself. This occurred while he was working as an employee at a production company called Cinerama, and he decided it would be an interesting idea to remake King Kong with the then revolutionary process, widescreen. So he hired Willis O'Brien to work on the film and to try to find a way to make the stop motion effects work with the widescreen process. And there was a lot of work that went into this. Now, this widescreen process was lazily dubbed Cinerama. I mean, come on now. I know your company's called Cinerama, but you couldn't really come up with a better name for it. He was struggling mightily, though, to adapt the stop motion to Cinerama because it is an incredibly complex process. It requires a lot of working parts, and it's something that we really take for granted today, how widescreen is something that's so easy, that every webcam, almost everything that you can buy that can shoot footage, it easily is able to do widescreen. But with stop motion effects and to shoot them in widescreen, it required 3 separate cameras filming side by side in perfect synchronization in order just to create a widescreen picture. And this was something that was really not looking like it was ever going to be possible, but eventually Willis made some serious headway, and he found a way to make this possible. He got the help of a Cinerama technician, and he created a set of interlocked motors that would make it possible for him to actually pull off the complicated process. But sadly, the technician that he was working for, or he was working with actually, the technician he was working with passed away before the motors could be built. And that was essentially the end of this project, which was going to be dubbed the Eighth Wonder. So, it would have been interesting to see what would have happened, what the Kong film would have looked like in 1952 with this widescreen process with stop motion effects by Willis O'Brien. But that wasn't the only reason why it was completely abandoned. The project was put on hold because they were trying to still build the technology in order to make it work. But then it was completely abandoned when Cooper left the company a short time later. So when he left the project and he left the company, the Eighth Wonder was dead. It was dead in its tracks. In the late 1950s, Willis O'Brien was at a serious low point in his life, and he decided in order to help turn his fortunes around and to improve his overall mood, it would be a good idea to work on another King Kong film, another Kong project. And this is around the time where he started to work on King Kong vs. Frankenstein, which was a proposed film idea where he would have King Kong face off with a version of the Frankenstein's monster. And he started working on this around 1960, and he kept working on it through 1961, and actually even further than that, because this was the basis for King Kong vs. Godzilla. Now, Willis O'Brien was a huge fan of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the novel, and he even wanted to make a Frankenstein film. He had a desire to make a Frankenstein film as early as the 1920s. He was young. He wrote a little sort of script treatment for an adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, and he never really got to make it, but it's something he always had a passion for. So he decided it would be fun to combine his two passions with King Kong with Frankenstein. And so he came up with this idea where he would have King Kong face off with the Frankenstein monster. And he had this concept already in mind where there would be a descendant of Dr. Frankenstein who would have a laboratory somewhere in the jungle, and the mad doctor would create another Frankenstein's monster, but this time it would be like 15 meters high, and he created out of dead body parts and corpses and things like that. The monster would attack the doctor, kill him, and then escape, and news of the monster would spread to the United States and to other parts of the world. and there would be photographic evidence that would show up. And this inspired a certain promoter from San Francisco to take the Frankenstein's monster and take it to San Francisco and use it for display. And Carl Denham decides, oh, I could do the same thing. I'll go back to Skull Island and I'll recapture Kong. And apparently Kong is still on Skull Island in this version. I don't know what it is. I thought Skull Island was completely wiped away. Apparently this is like a reboot of the Kong films, I guess. Or it's the Kong, but King Kong vs. Godzilla hasn't happened yet, so it's just one of those things that's like, how does this even work? But anyway, Denham was going to go back to Skull Island and capture Kong and bring Kong back to San Francisco. And there would be a huge interest in seeing these two monsters in one place at one time. And they'd put Kong and the Frankenstein's monster in these giant cages in the middle of a stadium. And then the two of them would break out of the cages. They'd start fighting in the city. They'd destroy large parts of it. And the film would culminate in a climax where the two monsters would battle on the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, this was the first draft and the first idea that Willis O'Brien had for King Kong vs. Frankenstein. He was worried that he would not be able to use Frankenstein because Universal might have a copyright on the Frankenstein's monster. But the thing is, Universal only had the copyrights for a look, for the particular look of the Frankenstein's monster that they used with Jack Pierce's makeup with Boris Karloff in the Universal classic monster movies, Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. So he couldn't have Frankenstein look like that, but eventually he just decided, okay, maybe just to play it safe, he decided to title his story King Kong versus the Ginkgo, because he didn't know that. He didn't know that he could still have a Frankenstein film and still be able to have a Frankenstein's monster in it and not really get permission from Universal. So he changed things around and called it King Kong versus the Ginkgo. The word Ginkgo is a mixture of the words King and Kong. And despite this, despite the fact that he changed things around and the fact that he knew that Frankenstein's monster was something that he could use, he could not get any studio or producer to get interested in his script or invest in it at all. So he reworked his script and he abandoned the idea of a creature assembled of human parts in favor of a monster created from various wild animals. And he believed that the duel would be more effective if Kong faced off with another wild animal, so to speak, just like Kong. So the second version of the film would actually take place after the events of the first movie, or Son of Kong and things like that, where apparently Kong did not die after the fall from the Empire State Building and from his wounds. He was actually in a coma of sorts and was smuggled back to Skull Island by Carl Denham for treatment, which is extremely close to the concept that was going to be that was used for King Kong Lives. And then it flashes forward 30 years later, and Carl Denham has this concept of finding King Kong again and organizing a fight with another monster in San Francisco. And there's Dr. Frankenstein's grandson builds another Frankenstein's monster, this time out of various animal parts, rhinoceros, elephants, and other African animals. And the monster, of course, ends up killing its creator. He destroys the laboratory. He gets captured by promoters, and he gets brought back to San Francisco. There's an auditorium, just like the first draft, and the Frankenstein's monster and Kong are there in the auditorium. Denham decides to develop an actual number where he would have a girl walk on a tightrope that is stretched 10 meters off the ground between the two hands of the Ginkgo. When the rope breaks, though, Kong believes that the Ginkgo is attacking the girl, So he frees himself from his cage and he attacks the creature. And the battle spills out into the streets of San Francisco, and they end up fighting on the Golden Gate Bridge again, and then the film would end with the two of them disappearing into the ocean, which is very similar to King Kong vs. Godzilla in terms of the ending. He even did a bunch of sketches for this concept that are actually really cool. They're really wonderful works of art. And when you look at these sketches, it's like, man, I really wish this was made instead of King Kong vs. Godzilla. As much as I like parts of King Kong vs. Godzilla, I honestly would have preferred this movie, this idea, this concept that Willis O'Brien had, that he put a lot of his time and effort into. So he brought his many sketches to Daniel O'Shea, who was one of the presidents of RKO, and he was interested in the project, so he presented it to a producer named John Beck, who he thought could follow up on it. Beck liked the idea, but he asked this writer named George Worthing Yates to write a new story called King Kong vs. Prometheus. The character of the Ginkgo was changed because Carl Denham's character was really suppressed in this draft. In this third draft of the story, the Prometheus is the creation of Kurt Frankenstein, who dreams of building an army of worker giants. Unveiled to the public in San Francisco's Candlestick Park, the monster demonstrates unexpected abilities, becoming more cunning from day to day. He ends up killing his creator and then confronts King Kong, who is also exhibited in the park. From that moment on, though, the story follows the exact same path as Brian's previous script. Now, John Beck, he tried to sell the idea in the United States, but nobody was interested in funding the film, so he went overseas to Italy and Japan to try to get interest and funds for the movie, for the project. And he actually got Toho interested in funding the movie on one condition, that the Frankenstein monster is changed to Godzilla. So he agreed to do that. And they thought it would be a great idea to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Toho and King Kong. So Beck and Toho, they acquired the rights from RKO, and with a $25,000 a percentage on profits. And Shinji Suzukawa was hired to write the final script, which would end up becoming King Kong vs. Godzilla. And finally, after all these years, after all this time, O'Brien's original script came to life, but it was not in the way that O'Brien had at all envisioned. Beck, unfortunately, did not keep O'Brien informed of what was going on. He didn't give him tabs, he didn't give him anything, he didn't give him any information about what was going on with his project. And O'Brien only found out what was going on with his King Kong film when he saw a newspaper article that announced that John Beck, who had not been in contact with O'Brien for several months, was at Toho Studios in Tokyo putting the final touches on King Kong vs. Godzilla. And that's where he found out that Kong in this film was being played by a guy in an ape suit. And this devastated O'Brien, because he hoped to use stop motion animation in the film to have a stop motion Frankenstein and a stop motion King Kong, and it was devastating to him. And he just realized that all his hard work, all his effort, and everything that he put into this project for all these years was completely wasted, was completely destroyed, and it completely destroyed him as a result, because O'Brien died very soon after learning what had happened to his project, what had happened to his idea, to his baby. He died on November 8th, 1962 at the age of 76. Never really getting to see his dream project fully realized on screen. And yeah, I made it at the age of 76. But yeah, it's just one of those things that's just like, wow. When you look at these drawings and you hear about the idea, and you see how sleazy John Beck was, and how he died not seeing his project, his final project, the project that he was hoping he would end his career on. He was not able to work on it. He was not able to do it because Toho and John Beck had made a deal, and they decided to make King Kong versus Godzilla instead. But yeah, that's the saga of King Kong versus Frankenstein. It's a interesting one. This is one of the few King Kong films that were never made that I definitely wanted to take a good amount of time talking to you guys about. And also, it's one that I do wish was actually made. I wish this was produced. I wish this was a film that wasn't just a series of sketches and some scripts and an idea by Willis O'Brien. I really do wish this film was fully realized, and I wish it was made. In 1969, Marion C. Cooper once again jumped into the fray and started throwing out more wild ideas for another King Kong film. And this time it is one of the wildest yet. I don't know how this came up. Apparently he was at some comic book convention talking with some comic book artists, and they were wanting to do a series of comics about Kong and about Skull Island, and he at first completely rejected the idea and didn't want to do it, but then he had some fever dream or something, or a conversation with somebody, and it led to him having this concept of Space Kong. So he imagined King Kong on an asteroid drifting into space. And so there's this idea that started floating around that included Carl Denham's character, and he ended up talking to Charles Fitzsimmons, who was producer and close friend of the Cooper family, and they ended up coming up with this crackpot idea that Denham's character was able to stay young because of some geriatric substance, which would ultimately become a river of eternal youth, and Denham would have found this river, and that would explain why he has not changed in terms of his age, in terms of his look. And the setting would have been composed with billions of life-sustaining planets, some with civilizations millions of years ahead of us, and possibly of the ultimate world lost in space, making a small planet the size of a large asteroid. So there would be it would take place on a small planet the size of a large asteroid, which is divided into two distinct worlds, and on each side, I mean, it's just confusing. I mean, it's one of those things that's just like, I can't even believe it. I'm sorry. I'm flipping my words because I'm just like, this is an acid. He was high in acid or something. Like, this is the type of shit you come up with when you're high. This is not a good idea. King Kong in space? What the hell are you smoking, Marion C. Cooper? I'm sorry, man. I mean, really, dude. Seriously. This is a bad idea. So it was supposed to take place on this large asteroid planet. It was going to be divided into two worlds. On one side, there's a world that has an eternal spring. It's a paradise. It's made of beauty and wonder, and the river of eternal youth is flowing through it. And then on the other side, it's a prehistoric hell ruled by savagery, and it's a chaotic world teeming with dinosaurs, and where a struggle of survival would be the thing that is the most paramount. And this is where you would find the most incredible creatures, the reincarnation of King Kong. Like, King Kong's just there. I don't know why. I have no idea. He's just there. So King Kong would be here, and this new Kong would have been brought back to civilization to find death by sophisticated futuristic fire in a situation that is very similar to the final scene in the 1933 film on the Empire State Building, where Kong is killed by Beauty, just as in the original film. Cooper and Fitzsimmons thought they could make the film as soon as the rights for the film were no longer tied up in the courts, but they never had time to write, let alone try to get funding for such a trippy, wild, and psychedelic project. And even if they did get the rights, the film would have stayed a fever dream. There's no way this would ever have gotten made in a million fucking years. So, and by the way, this is from a source that I got it from like some French blog and things like that, where he found some information and things like that. So this, for all I know, could not necessarily be true, but it doesn't sound that far-fetched, knowing Marion C. Cooper and the kind of crazy stuff he was, and the fact that he was wanting to do another Kong in 1934 after Son of Kong, and he wanted to do The Eighth Wonder. So, I mean, it really would not surprise me that he would want to do this, and he'd want to have Kong in space. King Kong in space? Give me a break. That's one of the dumbest ideas I've ever heard in my life. So glad that movie did not get made. I'm glad that was never fully realized, that's for sure. In 1966, legendary British horror film production company Hammer Films tried to get their own King Kong remake off the ground. Now, Hammer Films, as you all know, or if you don't know, Hammer Films was really well known for making a living off of remakes of classic Universal monster movies like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Mummy, and so on. And they felt for their 100th film, it would be a really cool thing to do to make a remake of the 1933 film King Kong. Well, they ran into serious rights issues, and they weren't even really able to even get into a really true pre-production phase. They weren't even able to get a script treatment written. They weren't even able to get a screenplay out there. It was just an idea they wanted to do, but they approached RKO and asked them for permission to use the rights to do a remake of King Kong, and RKO just flatly refused and said no. At this time, RKO had a no remake clause on King Kong, and that was it. Hammer really wasn't able to go any further with that. So they ended up doing a remake of, I think it was 10,000 years BC, 1 million years BC instead. And I'm sorry, I got confused with 10,000 BC, which is that shitty Roland Emmerich movie. So anyway, they did a remake of 1 million years BC with, I think, Ursula Andress. And that was their 100th film. They wanted to do King Kong, but RKO said no. This did not deter Hammer, though. They kept trying. In 1970, after seeing a impressive commercial for a Volkswagen, which featured a stop motion effects by David Allen, they decided, we want to try to do this again. We want to try to make another King Kong film with stop motion effects by David Allen. And they approached Hammer about it, and Hammer approached RKO about it, and RKO brought the hammer down on Hammer and said no. Again, there's like no remake clause. You're not remaking King Kong. No way. And that is the end of Hammer's Kong. That would have definitely been interesting to see Hammer's take on King Kong. And it is sad that we have knockoffs like Queen Kong and Ape that got made, but we weren't able to see Hammer's King Kong. But yeah, it never really got past the idea phase for both of the adaptations that Hammer was planning on making or wanted to make. So it's one of those interesting things, but at the same time, there really isn't that much information about Hammer's Kong. It was just they wanted to do it, and RKO said no, not once, but twice. And that was all she wrote. In 1974, stop-motion effects artist Jim Danforth and his good friend Steve Barkett, who was also a fellow special effects artist as well as a writer, they became heavily interested and intrigued and curious about what it would be like and what it would look like if they made their own remake of King Kong. They, just like Hammer and other companies before them, tried to approach RKO and got an RKO out of nowhere for their trouble. But Steve Barkett was completely undeterred. He was like, no, I'm going to do whatever I can to find a way to bring this project to life. And he went the extra mile and did a lot of research. And through his research, he discovered that the rights for the novelization of the 1933 film King Kong, which was based on the script of the 1933 movie, had expired in 1960, which technically made it legal for Jim and Steve to make their own version of King Kong, as long as it was based on the adaptation, as long as it was based on the novelization of the film, which is so crazy to me. I'm a huge fan of novelizations. I have a lot of them. I even have the King Kong novelization, and there's a lot of people who probably don't know really what a novelization is, and I'm like one of the few people that do know that. It's kind of a lost art. And I mean, because I guarantee if you went on the street and asked somebody what a novelization is, a lot of people are like, "What? What are you talking about? A novel?" Yeah, I know what a novel is. It's like, no, it's a novelization. It's a different thing. But anyway, it's crazy to imagine that this is the one instance in film history where a novelization was a big deal. Like, a novelization is what made it possible for a remake of King Kong to finally be made, and for producers and studios to get around the no remake clause by RKO. Now, RKO found out about this, and immediately they threatened to sue, and this is rumored, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So they threatened to sue Jim and Steve, and Jim and Steve, though, they wanted to make the movie, but they didn't really have a lot of money to begin with. And they were like, well, we don't really have the cash to mount a legal defense. So they canceled the project. They left it behind. And that's really only as far as it ever got. They wanted to do it. They did the research, discovered that the rights had expired for the novelization. And Steve also did some extra research and found some information that might have suggested that the rights for the 1933 film had also expired, but he didn't have enough concrete evidence to really pursue that. So ultimately, yeah, their film didn't get made, but the ripple effect of the research by Steve Barkett would be immense. It would be absolutely massive. Because of the research that Steve Barkett did and the revelation that, wow, you can get around RKO's no remake clause by doing a remake of the novelization, by doing an adaptation of the novelization of the 1933 film, which the novel itself is based on the screenplay, and it's written by Delos W. Lovelace. If you did your remake based on that, you could do it. And that leads to Dino De Laurentiis' 1976 King Kong remake that he did for Paramount. That's the only reason why that was ever able to get made. And that leads to the next film on the list, Universal's The Legend of King Kong. But that will have to wait for another time. That will have to wait for part 2 of the Never Wers on the King Kong films. I hope you enjoyed part 1, though. And as always, I will see you guys later. See ya.